Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into something pretty complicated.
Yeah.
So buckle up. The economic situation in Europe.
Yeah, it's a mess.
It's a mess, to say the least. And a big part of that mess seems to stem from Ukraine's stance on Russian gas.
Yeah, their decision to halt the transit of Russian gas through their territory has definitely had a ripple effect throughout the entire continent.
Yeah, and it's not just about the halt itself. We're also looking at some, shall we say, controversial actions that have targeted Russian energy infrastructure.
Yeah, there are some pretty serious allegations floating around about Ukraine's involvement in those attacks.
Allegations that are causing quite a stir, shall we say.
Yeah, definitely raising eyebrows.
Particularly among those European nations that were heavily reliant on Russian gas before all of this went down.
It's put a lot of countries in a very difficult position, especially those who didn't really have a plan B when it came to their energy supply.
Right. So let's rewind a bit. Ukraine says no more Russian gas flowing through its pipelines. What happens next?
Well, chaos ensues.
As one might expect.
But in all seriousness, some countries were better prepared than others. Hungary, for example, had the Turkish Stream pipeline as a backup, which helped mitigate the immediate impact. But even that lifeline is looking a bit shaky now.
You're talking about the attacks on the Russian energy infrastructure, right? Allegedly carried out by Ukrainian forces.
Right. It's a pretty bold move if you think about it. Attacking infrastructure that's essentially keeping the lights on in other European countries.
And Hungary is not happy about it, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely not. Their foreign minister even went so far as to call it an attack on their sovereignty.
Yeah, I read that. That's some pretty strong language.
Well, it shows just how seriously they're taking this. They see it as a direct threat to their national security.
And rightfully so. I mean, their dependence on that pipeline makes them incredibly vulnerable.
Exactly. And it's not just about Hungary. Slovakia is in a tough spot, too. They don't even have access to the Turkish Stream, so they're feeling the pinch even more acutely.
So they're completely cut off from Russian gas.
Essentially, yes, which is a huge problem for their economy and for their citizens who are now facing rising energy costs.
So you've got these very real economic consequences playing out, and then you have the political fallout on top of that. It seems like this situation has put a real strain on relations between Ukraine and some of its European neighbors.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There have been some very tense exchanges, particularly between Slovakia and Ukraine. The Slovakian prime minister reportedly reached out to Zelenskyy to express his concerns about the halted gas transit and to propose a meeting to try and find a solution.
And how did it go over?
Not well. From what I've read, Zelenskyy was pretty dismissive, brushed off the prime minister's concerns, and didn't seem interested in engaging in any kind of meaningful dialogue.
Wow. So much for diplomacy.
Yeah, it seems like Zelensky's more focused on maintaining his image as a strongman than on actually addressing the very real problems that his actions are causing for other countries.
Well, it's definitely playing well with his online supporters.
Oh, yeah, they're eating it up.
But for the everyday citizens in places like Slovakia who are facing rising energy costs, it's a different story. They're wondering why their concerns aren't being taken more seriously.
Right. It's a classic example of the disconnect between the online world and the real world consequences that people are facing on the ground.
And it's not just Slovakia either. The president of Slovakia has also taken a pretty firm stance. He's basically said that he sees no point in meeting with Zelenskyy just for a photo op. If there's no real progress on resolving this energy crisis, he's not interested.
I think that's a pretty reasonable position to take.
I agree. It's a sign that some European leaders are starting to lose patience with the empty gestures. They need concrete solutions, not just symbolic shows of support.
Exactly. And it brings us to a rather intriguing observation. Even countries like Germany, which were heavily impacted by the Nord Stream pipeline attacks, haven't been as vocal about their own energy security concerns as one might expect.
That is interesting. It's almost as if there's this unspoken pressure to prioritize support for Ukraine's actions, even if it means downplaying the economic pain being felt at home.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that any criticism of Ukraine is seen as being pro-Russia, which is a dangerous oversimplification of a very complex situation.
Right. It's like you're either with us or against us. And there's no room for nuance or for acknowledging the legitimate concerns that some European countries have.
Exactly. And that kind of black and white thinking is incredibly dangerous. It prevents us from having honest conversations about the challenges we're facing and from finding real solutions.
So what's the end game here? What are Ukraine's motivations in all of this?
Well, there's a lot of speculation going around. Some suggest that this is a calculated move to disrupt the flow of Russian gas and create a market for American hydrocarbons in Europe.
So the idea is that by cutting off Russian gas, Ukraine is essentially paving the way for the U.S. to step in as the primary energy supplier.
That's the theory. But it's a theory riddled with complexities. First and foremost, there are serious questions about the feasibility of replacing Russian gas with American alternative. The U.S. would need to significantly ramp up production and export capacity, which is no small feat. And even if they could pull it off, the cost would likely be much higher for European consumers.
Yeah. It also seems like a strategy fraught with uncertainty. I mean, how can Europe rely on a steady supply of American gas when the U.S. itself is undergoing an energy transition with a focus on renewable sources? Seems like a gamble, to say the least.
A gamble with potentially enormous economic consequences. And then there are the logistical hurdles. Can the U.S. realistically meet the EU's massive energy demands, especially with winter approaching? And what happens if those supplies fall short? These are critical questions that don't seem to have clear answers.
So essentially, we're looking at a situation where Ukraine's actions, while aimed at hurting Russia, are having unintended consequences for its European allies, who are now facing an energy crunch with no easy solutions.
Exactly. And this brings us to another layer of this intricate web. The Biden administration, while advocating for a green energy transition, has also taken actions that have hindered domestic oil and gas production in the U.S.
It's almost like they're trying to have it both ways.
It does seem a bit contradictory.
Yeah, on one hand, they're pushing for a greener future, but on the other hand, they're potentially creating a scenario where Europe becomes even more reliant on fossil fuels just from a different source.
It's a paradox with potentially significant geopolitical and economic ramifications. And then you have the recent sanctions imposed by the Biden administration, specifically targeting Russian oil tankers and maritime insurance providers. These sanctions are intended to further pressure Russia, but they've also sparked concerns among some European officials, particularly in Hungary.
Why is Hungary particularly worried?
Well, they believe that these sanctions will backfire on Central Europe, particularly Serbia, which relies heavily on Russian oil. It's a reminder that these sanctions, while aimed at Russia, have a ripple effect that can impact other countries, sometimes in unintended and harmful ways.
It's a tough spot for Europe to be in. They want to support Ukraine, but they're also deeply dependent on Russian energy. And the sanctions that are aimed at punishing Russia are also hurting them.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act with no easy answers. The Biden administration argues that the current economic climate is favorable for American families to bear the cost of these sanctions, suggesting that it's a necessary sacrifice to pressure Russia.
But isn't that a bit of a double standard? I mean, they're asking American families to bear the cost of sanctions that are also hurting European economies, all in the name of pressuring Russia.
It's a complex issue for sure, and the immediate effects of these sanctions are already being felt. Numerous ships carrying Russian oil are unable to dock stranded near India and China due to cautious partners. Freight costs have skyrocketed further, driving up the price of oil.
So even though the sanctions are intended to punish Russia, they're also disrupting global trade and driving up costs for everyone. It's a messy situation, to say the least.
It really is. And it highlights the interconnectedness of the global economy and the unintended consequences that can arise from these types of actions. And while there will likely be ways to circumvent these sanctions, it will come at a cost. We're already seeing oil prices climb, with Brent crude surpassing $80 per barrel.
And to make matters worse, I understand that some European countries are actually pushing to lower the price cap on Russian oil even further. Doesn't that seem counterintuitive, given that oil prices are already rising?
It's a risky move for sure. Russia has indicated that they might refuse to sell oil at a lower price, which could lead to a global oil shortage and send prices soaring even higher. It's a gamble that could backfire spectacularly, not just for Europe, but for the entire world.
So we're essentially teetering on the brink of a major energy crisis with the potential for far-reaching consequences.
That's not an exaggeration. The impact on developing countries in Asia and Latin America could be particularly severe. These countries are already struggling with limited resources for economic development, and rising oil prices will only exacerbate their challenges, potentially leading to further instability and unrest.
It's a sobering reminder that these geopolitical maneuvers have far-reaching consequences, often hitting the most vulnerable the hardest.
Indeed. And it brings us to another significant development in this saga: President Biden's recent remarks as he prepares to leave office.
Oh boy. This ought to be interesting.
He chose to highlight his perceived achievements, claiming to have weakened U.S. adversaries and prevented a nuclear war. He also took credit for uniting the world in support of Ukraine, portraying a narrative of authoritarian states uniting out of weakness.
It's a carefully crafted narrative for sure. But I do find it interesting that he made no mention of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which wasn't exactly a shining example of American strengths on the world stage.
His omission, whether intentional or not, is noteworthy. And it does make you wonder how much of what he's saying is actually rooted in reality.
Right. It's a bit like Zelensky's tendency to downplay the problems that Ukraine's actions are causing for its European neighbors. There seems to be this disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground.
Yeah, there's definitely a pattern emerging here, and it's not a good one.
So let's talk about this claim of preventing nuclear war. Can Biden really take credit for that?
Well, it's debatable. Some might argue that the strategic withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson, which averted a potential military catastrophe, played a more significant role than any direct actions by Biden.
That's a good point. And yet, shortly after that withdrawal, Biden authorized the use of U.S. weapons to strike Russian territory, a move that arguably escalated the conflict and brought the world closer to the very nuclear war he claims to have prevented.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it?
To say the least.
It raises questions about the true motivations behind these actions and the potential for unintended consequences. I mean, why has Russia exercised restraint in using nuclear weapons? It's a complex question. Some speculate that they might have doubts about the effectiveness of their arsenal, concerns about global repercussions, or perhaps they're holding out hope for negotiations with a future U.S. administration.
It's almost comical to think that a future U.S. administration might end up negotiating a deal with Russia that mirrors what Biden could have potentially achieved back in 2021, effectively preventing this entire conflict.
The irony is certainly palpable. And then there's this whole notion of a united world that Biden keeps emphasizing. It's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't really reflect the reality on the ground. We're seeing growing anti-Ukraine sentiment in Europe, and the current political coalition is looking increasingly fragile.
Germany might be the exception. Support for Ukraine seems to be relatively strong there, at least for now. But even they aren't immune to the potential for political backlash as the economic costs continue to mount.
It's a very precarious situation. And it all circles back to Biden's visit to Kyiv, that highly symbolic gesture of support. Remember, that visit was only made possible by the Istanbul agreements, which Ukraine later undermined potentially with U.S. involvement.
So the U.S. might have actually played a role in sabotaging a potential peace deal.
It's a possibility. And it raises serious questions about the true nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine.
It seems like there's a lot happening beneath the surface, a lot of political maneuvering and behind-the-scenes dealings that we're not privy to.
That's for sure. And now we have this new development regarding the frozen Russian assets.
You mean that $300 billion that was seized?
Exactly. There are reports that the Biden administration is urging European allies to transfer those funds to a dedicated account, presumably to be used for Ukraine's reconstruction.
Wow, that's a bold move. But wouldn't that be incredibly controversial?
Oh, absolutely. This proposal has sparked a lot of anxiety among European leaders, especially since most of these assets are held within the EU, potentially exposing them to legal challenges and liability.
It's one thing to freeze assets, but it's a whole other ballgame to actually take ownership of them and then decide how to use them. It creates a whole host of legal and ethical dilemmas.
You're absolutely right. And these concerns are reflected in the differing viewpoints within Germany. A leading candidate for chancellor is advocating for the transfer of assets, while others are much more hesitant, likely worried about the implications for German citizens and the potential legal fallout.
It's a contentious issue for sure. And it's highly unlikely that an agreement will be reached before the end of Biden's term.
Which just adds to the uncertainty of it all. What happens after Biden leaves office is anyone's guess.
Especially when you consider that a potential future U.S. administration has expressed skepticism about Ukraine's strategic importance and has even leveled accusations of corruption against Zelenskyy in the past. It's hard to imagine them being eager to transfer billions of dollars to Ukraine given their previous stance. So Ukraine's future is hanging in the balance dependent on the whims of American politics.
It would seem so. And then there's Zelenskyy's own proposal for continuous funding of the war effort, essentially asking Europe to foot the bill for arms purchases from the U.S. It raises serious concerns about the potential for perpetual conflict and the disturbing implications of lowering the conscription age in Ukraine, essentially sending younger and younger citizens to the front lines.
It paints a very bleak picture. A never-ending war, fueled by foreign money and weaponry, with Ukrainian youth paying the ultimate price.
It's a troubling thought, and one that underscores the need for a drastic shift in perspective, a move away from this cycle of escalation and towards a genuine pursuit of peace. And it really makes you question the whole narrative of unity and global solidarity. It's easy to talk about standing with Ukraine when you're not the one bearing the economic brunt of their actions.
That's like virtue signaling on a global scale.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that point about the photo ops. It's one thing for politicians to show up in Kyiv for a photo op, but it's quite another to actually make the tough decisions that are necessary to address the root causes of this conflict.
Because let's face it, sending weapons and imposing sanctions is easy. It's a lot harder to sit down with your adversaries and try to find common ground.
Exactly. And it's that lack of willingness to engage in real diplomacy that's so concerning. It's like everyone's more interested in scoring political points than in actually finding a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, it's all about who can appear the toughest on Russia. And in the meantime, the people of Europe are the ones paying the price.
It's a cynical game, and it's one that's being played at the expense of ordinary citizens.
And speaking of cynical games, let's talk about this whole situation with the frozen Russian assets.
Ah, yes. The $300 billion question?
Exactly. The Biden administration is pushing for European allies to transfer those funds to a dedicated account.
Yeah.
But it's causing a lot of anxiety within the EU.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. Most of those assets are held within the EU, so transferring them could create a whole host of legal liabilities for European countries. It's a risky proposition, to say the least.
It's one thing to freeze assets as a punitive measure, but it's quite another to actually seize them and then decide how to use them. That sets a dangerous precedent.
It does. And it raises all sorts of ethical questions as well. I mean, what gives the U.S. the right to dictate how European countries handle assets that are held within their own borders?
Right. It smacks of hypocrisy.
Right.
Especially when you consider that the U.S. has its own history of seizing assets from countries that it doesn't agree with.
Exactly. So it's not like the U.S. has the moral high ground here, and yet they're the ones calling the shots.
It's classic American exceptionalism. We get to do whatever we want, but everyone else has to follow our rules.
It's a pattern that we've seen play out time and time again, and it's one that's not likely to change anytime soon.
Especially with the political climate being what it is in the U.S. Right now, it's all about projecting strength and showing Russia who's boss.
And the long-term consequences, be damned.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game, and one that we're all going to have to pay the price for eventually.
That's the scary part. This isn't just a game. It has real-world implications for people's lives and for the future of our planet.
Well said. So where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I think the first step is to acknowledge that there are no easy answers. This is a complex situation with a long and tangled history, and there are no quick fixes.
Right. We can't just throw money and weapons at the problem and expect it to go away.
Exactly. We need to be willing to have those tough conversations, to engage in real diplomacy, and to find solutions that address the underlying issues.
It's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of good faith on all sides.
It will, but it's the only way forward if we want to avoid a catastrophic outcome.
Yeah, it feels like we've just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to unpack.
Oh, absolutely. We could talk about this for hours and still only scratch the surface.
But I think we've at least laid out some of the key issues.
Yeah, and highlighted the complexities.
For sure. And I think one of the most important takeaways for me is that there's no easy solution to this.
No silver bullet.
Nope. It's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of good faith on all sides.
And a willingness to see beyond the immediate to the long-term consequences of our actions.
Because those consequences are real.
Yeah.
And they're going to be felt by everyone, not just the people directly involved in the conflict.
Exactly. We're all connected, whether we like it or not.
So what can we do? I mean, as individuals, is there anything we can do to make a difference?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, to educate ourselves about the complexities of this situation, and to challenge the simplistic narratives that are often presented to us.
Right. To not just accept what we're being told, but to dig deeper and to ask those tough questions.
Exactly. And to hold our leaders accountable, to demand better from them.
Because ultimately, they're the ones who have the power to make the decisions that will shape the future.
And those decisions will have consequences for all of us.
Well said. So I guess that's our call to action, folks. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious.
Because knowledge is power. And in a situation like this, we need all the power we can get.
Well, that's going to do it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay safe out there.